Okay. And yes, I've seen the video. I'm aware she's trying to paint me as this abuser. Well, if she fell on this day, why didn't you tell Facebook until this day? Obviously, if you didn't tell Facebook until now, you must not have told the police until now. Because Facebook is directly connected to the 911 system. The moment you report something to 911, it is instantly updated to Facebook so everybody knows the timestamps. Kathy's theory is that I didn't call 911 fast enough and that's why her mother died. If that was the case, why did her mother not die on the scene, during the surgery, or even just before the surgery? Right? If the fracture is what killed her in that small time period while we discussed what to do, because I was not going to call the ambulance until she was ready. I don't give a fuck what any of you think about me for that. Meemaw did not want to go to the hospital. She had spent the majority of 2015 in the hospital. She was extremely sick. And she did not want to go back. She did not know how badly she was injured. We had to figure that out through her trying to get up, get dressed. Before she would allow me to call the ambulance, she wanted to get dressed first in a 3-piece suit and put on some makeup. Okay? She wasn't lying there screaming in agony, crying, "Please call help, please." She was saying, "Just give me a minute, Mary. I'm fine. I don't need to go to the hospital. Give me a minute." Okay. Why don't you go get my underwear and if I have to go to the hospital, I at least have to have some underwear on. So just go get me my clothes and you can help me get dressed and then we will call somebody. Okay, these are two very different realities. Kathy's version of what happened just did not happen. And my version, nobody will believe because me and my grandmother had a relationship that is different from me and pretty much everybody else in this family. When my grandmother broke her hip, she was sick. She was weak. She had been malnourished for a long time. Not because I wasn't feeding her. Kathy likes to say, well, how was she malnourished if you were taking care of her? Because she didn't like to eat. Near the end, she couldn't eat. She was always sick. Anybody that knew her would know that. The last time she was in the hospital, before she broke her hip, she was there for about a 2-month stay. And the doctors and nurses got so frustrated with her because they could not get her to eat. At one point, they were threatening to force feed her, like tube up the nose. Force feed a near 80-something-year-old woman who just refused to eat. Like, my grandmother loved telling people the story that her doctor went into his private personal fridge and brought her his personal cheese just so she would eat something. After about a week of them begging her to eat something, he went and got her his personal cheese, and she laughed and talked about how the nurses talked about that so long, how that doctor never gave anybody his personal cheese. But that was all Meemaw wanted, and that was all she was gonna eat. Imagine being in the hospital for 2 months and the doctors and nurses can't get you to eat. And so they send you home with your caregiver granddaughter who is mentally unwell. You're taking care of each other. And I'm supposed to be able to force her to eat when the doctors and the nurses couldn't. I'm supposed to I'm so magical and perfect, right? I could do things that the doctors couldn't. She was so sick the last time she went to the hospital before breaking her hip that they wanted to do a colonoscopy on her because they had found they said a thickness. They said they found a thickness and they wanted to go up and look at it. And they got her prepared for it, but then they weren't able to do the full procedure because they said that she was not physically strong enough to handle a colonoscopy at that time. Because of how sick she was, because of how malnourished she was, her body was not strong enough to handle that procedure. Yet, just about a couple of months later, without anything changing except her hip breaking, she was strong enough to undergo a hip surgery. So, after my grandmother fell, we discussed what to do because she didn't want to go to the hospital. It took her a little while to decide that she was injured enough that it was a good idea to go. They gave her the transplant that day, like a couple of hours later. They rushed her in emergency surgery, gave her a new hip. A couple of days after that, she was feeling better. Like, they were moving her over to a rehabilitation center that was less invasive. It was more like a nursing home and less like a hospital. Because they said she was on the uptick. She went through this surgery, she was feeling great, and all she had to do was learn how to walk again. And then she stopped eating again. And then she got pneumonia. And she got sick. And they moved her from the nursing home where she was having rehab back over to the emergency room. When she passed away, she had been in the hospital for 5 weeks. And it was not a in the ICU the entire time situation. She was not at death's door until, like, God, I want to say 3 weeks in. That was when she got pneumonia. But when she first got the transplant, we all thought she was going to go home. Like, they were ordering, like, hospital beds and shit to take to the condo that they found out couldn't even fit through the door because the condo was so small. And Kathy's laughing at me. Well, you didn't even want Mother to come home at that time. You cried and begged them not to send her home. Yeah, because she was dying. She was very clearly dying. And you guys were like, well, let's just send her home and let her die. Let Mary watch it happen at the house. We'll get the hospital bed. We'll get everything. And then we can leave. And let Mary sit there and watch her waste away in that back bedroom. No, obviously I didn't want to do that. I wanted her to stay in the hospital until she was capable of coming home. Not to die, but to live. I never expected her to die. Up until the day she passed away, I was still saying, she is going to come home anytime, and all of these fucking people are going to leave, and we're going to get our life back. And it just never happened. It wasn't my fault that my grandmother passed away. It wasn't my fault that she broke her hip. It wasn't my fault that she had COPD. It wasn't my fault that she had cancer. It wasn't my fault that Fox News had her convinced that she had cancer running through her entire body from her head to her toes. Fox News had her convinced that she was dying. That for a while, she would not eat because everything she ate, she was convinced that Fox News had told her would kill her. She bought a new wave oven. She was so excited about this new wave oven. It could cook a roast in like 20 minutes. She bought it. I cooked her roast for her. She never took a bite of it. She refused it. And she never used a new wave again. She said, it cooked too fast. It's full of radiation. It'll kill us. It'll give us cancer. And I said, well, why did you buy it if you didn't? You know it was going to cook that fast. That's why you bought it. And she said, well, I didn't know, and I don't trust it now. Okay, that's the way she was getting in her end days. Her mind would go sometimes. When she was in the hospital, she would stare at a blank wall and tell us all the pretty things that were happening outside that window. She wasn't always lucid. She wasn't always with us. And it wasn't my fault. That's what happens when you get old, when you get sick. Kathy's so angry and wanting to blame somebody when there's nobody to blame. Wanting to paint a murder where there was not one. She legitimately just fell and had an accident. My grandmother had been on prednisone for 3 decades. When Kathy tells y'all that she was the picture of health, is she telling you that she had been on a very strong steroid for 30 years and every time they tried to wean her off of it, she died? Is that part of Kathy's reality? Because it's a big part of mine. Do y'all know what steroid does to the human body? Prednisone is not supposed to be used for long periods of time. It's only supposed to be used for maximum about a month. It's a very strong steroid, and my grandmother, once on it in the 80s, could not go off of it again. They tried many, many times to wean her off of it. She tried herself to wean herself off of it. She would die every time. Her lungs would just give out. Literally, for 30 years, she was only breathing because a steroid kept her lungs working. It is nobody's fault that somebody in that condition passes away in a hospital. Kathy wants to say, I just want to know what happened to my mother. You were in the hospital room with her when she passed away. You were in the room, holding her hand, looking into her eyes. And you still have the audacity to say that you don't know what happened? You know what happened. She told you what happened. And again, I wasn't standing behind her looking menacingly, making her say things. Oftentimes, I wasn't even there because the family made me uncomfortable, so I went wandering around in the woods to walk out my anxiety. She told everybody what happened herself. I didn't have to tell a single one of you what happened. She did. Why would she do that if it was a lie? Why would your mother lie to everybody, Kathy? And don't say, well, because she loved you and wanted to protect you. Obviously, she didn't, since she had you go and get rid of the will during those 5 weeks. Well, it was an accident. It was nobody's fault. But hey, can you do me a favor and go destroy the will that has been around since around 1994 that leaves Mary everything? Because I'd really like to make sure that that bitch winds up homeless. It's not her fault or anything. I just really like to make sure she winds up homeless, even though we've planned and saved and put in there were multiple bank accounts. There were multiple, my grandmother did everything she could to make sure I didn't wind up homeless. And yet, with her last breath, apparently, she told Kathy to go and get rid of everything that she had worked to get saved up for me. With her last breath, she told Kathy to make sure I became homeless, make sure that I never had any happiness for the rest of my existence. Why would my grandmother do that? She didn't. But I'm 100% sure that that's what Kathy heard and believed. I fully believe that's what she believed what my grandmother wanted. But it doesn't mean it's the reality of the situation. My grandmother was very, very sick and very, very weak and had spent the majority of that year in the hospital. And when she broke her hip at first, she did not want to go back to the hospital. But she did go, and she got better, and then she got worse. But when something like that happens, you don't get to just create a new timeline and say, well, you murdered her. You murdered her, even though she didn't die right away. And it really wasn't the hip transplant that killed her. It was a combination of her being so weak and catching pneumonia after the transplant. I didn't hurt my grandmother. I would never hurt my grandmother. Kathy is saying these things because she knows what she did to that will, and she wants to make sure everybody despises me enough that nobody will ever look into it. And if she could create me as the most hateful, cruel, ugly, dangerous person, then nobody will ever bother to look past what she's saying into the truth of what I am. Which is, I'm not dangerous. I'm not any of the things that she says I am. And there is no convincing her of that, and there is no convincing her thousands of followers that I don't deserve life because her mother passed away. My mother has also passed away, Kathy. Is that your fault? Do I get to sit around and say, my mother should have lived longer. Kathy killed her. My mother should have lived longer. Kathy must have done something. Something must have been done because she should have lived longer. You could do that with everybody. You could say, well, my father should have lived longer. Little Ronnie should have lived longer. Larry Gove, my papa, should have lived longer. Right? There's a whole lot of people in this world that you can get angry and mad and say they should have lived longer. Who can we punish for this because they should have lived longer? When life is just life. It can end for any of us at any moment. And it's not going to matter how many people scream, that's not fair. She was young. She should have lived. Life doesn't give a fuck. Sometimes people die even if they're young. Sometimes people die even if they're healthy. And sometimes people live very, very long lives and get extremely sick and weak, and their bodies just shut down, even in hospitals racked up to machines. And you don't get to just say that somebody else killed that person when you know that they were in a hospital with machines and doctors and nurses. It's disturbing what Kathy is doing. I'm not scared about her asking questions because I know that I didn't do anything wrong. And it doesn't even matter that she will never believe that. Because I know. And I've always known. And everything that Kathy is making up, she's literally making up. Just out of her head. And she's trying to have me destroyed for these theories that she's come up with. She's just pulled them out of her curls and willed them into her reality. Nobody killed your mother, Kathy. Your mother was elderly and sick and weak and died in a hospital bed with you standing right next to her. You had 5 weeks to talk to her and figure out what happened that night, and I'm sure you did many, many times, and I'm sure you just never believed her. That's not my fault or hers, is it? Because she told you all what happened. If you're gonna choose to you're gonna choose to not believe it because your opinions are so much more believable to you. You want to send your mother to her grave as a liar and say, well, she lied to everybody about what happened that night. My own mother lied to everybody. Why would she lie to everybody, Kathy? Why would Meemaw have lied to the police? Why would Meemaw have lied to the hospitals? Why would Meemaw have lied to you? Why would your mother have lied to you? In the state that she was, where she, at one point, she was not lucid. They had forgotten to give her the salt. And she was completely insane. And she still wasn't saying that anybody was killed her, or pushed her, or hurt her. You can't talk sense into an abuser. You cannot. Just like the people who are harassing me constantly and accusing me of murdering Roberta Laws, even though, even in the court records, it clearly says the man that murdered her confessed to murdering her. They're constantly going to scream at me and say, well, it's your fault. It is your fault that this man went online and created a completely fake identity and lied to you. It is your fault that he already had a fiancé while he was doing this. It's your fault that he did that. Your fault. Your fault. It's constant. It's always somebody else's fault that somebody chooses to do things like that, isn't it? So it's always somebody else's fault. Nobody can make their own decisions in this world, right? A grown man who is already a sex offender for being a pedophile, he can't choose of his own volition to create a fake identity and go online and lure in mentally unwell women. Obviously, the mentally unwell woman forced him to do that. Before even knowing him, I'm so magical, you know. I can do things like that. I must have gone back in time and forced my grandmother to care about me when I was just a baby. Tricked her into believing I was just an innocent. So devious.